Wyoming Territory, summer of 1888, the day the wind broke off the ridge, carrying with it the cries of a girl nobody wanted. The girl's name was Norah Mae Milton, 22 years old, and she stood alone at the edge of the Laramie settlement, her hands tucked into the threadbare shawl she had worn since she was 17. Her boots were too big, her skirts too short, and her presence too much for the folks in town. The preacher's wife had called her unlucky. The blacksmith's wife muttered "unwanted" under her breath whenever Norah passed by. And no one ever corrected them. Norah did not cry about it anymore. She had 2 children, Gideon, who was 7, and Grace, who had just turned 5. Their father had ridden off 4 years ago, left her with a busted cart, a broken promise, and a baby girl in her arms. Folks said she should have known better. Folks said she was a fool for loving a man with no land and no last name. Now they just called her unwanted. Not to her face, but loud enough when she walked by. She lived in a half-burned shack outside town with a leaky roof and a fence that leaned like it had given up on standing straight. Her hands were always chapped, her eyes always tired. And still, every morning, she walked into town with Gideon's small hand in hers and Grace trailing behind, hair wild, cheeks red, always humming some tune Norah never learned. The day everything changed started with dust on the horizon. A cattle drive rolled in from the south. Sunburned riders, tired horses, and the sound of hooves beating out a rhythm like thunder. Norah watched from the edge of the general store porch, arms folded over her chest. Gideon crouched beside her, watching the horses with wide eyes. One cowboy broke from the group, his horse moving slower than the others, calmer. His hat was pulled low, but when he looked up, his eyes caught hers. He dismounted with the kind of ease that said he belonged in the saddle. Tall, broad shoulders, dust on his boots and sweat on his collar. He walked like he had nothing to prove. His name was Silas Montgomery, 28, and he had just come from Montana. He tipped his hat to her. "Ma'am." Norah nodded once. "You're new." "Just passing through," he said. Then his eyes dropped to Gideon. "Your boy?" "Yes," she answered, voice steady. He looked back at her. "You got a husband?" "No," she said. He left. Silas nodded slowly, like he had heard that before, and hated it just as much every time. Later that afternoon, she found Grace crying near the livery barn, her knees scraped and her dress torn. Norah knelt beside her, trying to soothe her, when a small voice behind her said, "I saw what happened. Some boys pushed her." Gideon stood beside Silas. Silas stepped forward and held out a clean cloth. "Here," he said. "Let me help." Norah hesitated. Then she took the cloth and wiped Grace's knee. "She is just 5, Norah said, not quite to him, not quite to herself. "Children should not have to hurt like this," Silas said quietly. Then he crouched beside her, close enough she could smell the leather of his gloves and the sagebrush on his coat. Neither should their mother. Norah met his eyes. They were green, steady, and not pitying. The next day he was still in town. And the day after. He helped the blacksmith for a few coins, fixed a broken wheel for the livery, and brought Gideon a wooden whistle he carved himself. Norah tried not to look at him too long, but he kept showing up in the general store when she was buying flour, at the pump when she fetched water. Always with a quiet hello. Always with a soft look for Grace and a grin for Gideon. One evening, just before sunset, Norah found him at the edge of her fence, hammering a new board into place. "You do not have to do that," she said, wiping her hands on a rag. "I know," he said, "but I want to." "Why?" He looked up at her. "Because I asked God to send me someone strong. Someone who does not give up. Someone with a heart big enough to carry 2 little ones and still have room for me." Norah blinked. Silas stood and wiped his hands on his trousers. "And then I saw you. People call me unwanted." He stepped closer. "They do not see what I see. "And what do you see, Mr. Montgomery?" He smiled not wide, just enough to warm his face. "The only one I prayed for." Norah's chest tightened. She turned back toward the house, not trusting herself to speak. But that night, she sat at the edge of her bed, listening to the wind and the sound of Grace's snoring and Gideon's small sighs. And she thought of Silas, of the way his hands had smoothed the fence, of the way he looked at her like she mattered. The next morning, Gideon ran out ahead of her, laughing as Silas lifted him onto the back of his horse. "Hold on tight," Silas said. Norah stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed, heart thudding. "You are still here," she said. "I told the trail boss I would catch up later." She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He looked at her like it was the simplest truth in the world. "Because you need someone who stays." Norah felt her throat tighten. Later that week, when Grace got sick with fever, it was Silas who rode through the night to fetch the doctor. He sat beside Norah on the floor while Grace tossed and burned with heat, and he held her hand when Norah thought she might break. "She is strong," he whispered, "just like her mama." When Grace finally opened her eyes again, Norah wept into Silas's shoulder. 2 days later, he rode into town and returned with a bolt of fabric and 2 pairs of new boots, one Gideon's size, one Grace's. Norah stood on the porch, watching him unpack the bundle. "This is too much," she said. He met her eyes. "It is not enough." Norah stared at him, her hands trembling just slightly. "Why do you care?" He stepped in close, his voice low. "Because I see you, Norah, and I love what I see." She did not speak, just stared at him, the wind tugging at her skirt, her hands clenched at her sides. He did not rush her, but when she leaned forward, just enough for her hand to brush his, he reached out and held it tight. And she let him. They stood there, fingers entwined, the sun settling behind them and the warmth of something new blooming between them. And for the first time in years, Norah did not feel unwanted. The morning fog clung low over the pasture, silvering the grass and softening the world. A single rooster called from somewhere behind the barn, and Norah stood at the stove, sleeves rolled to her elbows, frying cornmeal mush in bacon grease. Grace sat cross-legged on the floor, folding scraps of old newspaper into clumsy boats, and Gideon pressed his nose to the window. "He's coming." Norah didn't lift her head. "You sure?" "I know his horses walk." She turned then, and through the mist she saw the shape of Silas, coat collar turned up, reins loose in one hand, a bundle tied behind his saddle. He rode slow, like he didn't want to startle the peace. "Get the table cleared," she said. She didn't ask herself why she cared if her cabin was tidy. She just moved, brushing crumbs into her apron, setting out the tin cups, wiping the table with the edge of her sleeve. When Silas stepped inside, he brought the scent of damp pine and horsehide with him. He set the bundle down by the door. "I brought something," he said, voice soft so it wouldn't wake the stillness. Norah glanced at the bundle, but didn't ask. He nodded toward Grace. "For her. Found a woman outside Rollins who makes cloth dolls. Traded some work for it." Grace looked up, curious, but stayed quiet until Norah gave the smallest nod. The girl crept to the bundle and unwrapped it. Inside lay a calico doll, its face stitched with neat eyes and a crooked smile. Grace didn't speak, just held it to her chest like it was a living thing. "I'll patch her dress for her," Norah said after a beat. Silas pulled off his hat, ran a hand through his damp hair. "Didn't mean to overstep." "You didn't." She met his eyes. "You remembered her name. I remember things that matter." Gideon tugged at his sleeve. "Will you show me how to set a rabbit snare today?" Silas knelt to his height. "If your mama says it's fine." Norah leaned against the stove. "So long as you're back before the sun drops past the ridge." After they left, Norah sat at the table, the skillet cooling beside her, and watched Grace rock the doll in her arms, whispering lullabies she made up on the spot. The quiet stretched long, steady. She didn't rush to fill it. By late afternoon, the boy came back with mud on his knees and a grin wide as the prairie sky. Silas followed with a string of 3 rabbits and a new tear in his shirt sleeve. "Snare worked," Gideon said, chest puffed. Norah raised an eyebrow. "You let him set it alone?" Silas shook his head. "I watched close. He's got patience, that one." Then, quieter, like his mama. That evening, Norah boiled the rabbits with onions and wild thyme. Silas stayed to eat, saying little, just passing things when needed, listening when the children chattered. When Grace nodded off at the table and Gideon rubbed his eyes, Norah sent them to bed. Outside, the moon hung low and full over the hills. Silas lingered near the porch rail, arms folded, the wood creaking beneath his boots. Norah stepped out, pulling her shawl tighter. "You planning to keep drifting?" she asked. "Was," he said, "a month ago. And now?" He didn't answer, just looked out across the fields. Wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves. "You ever had a place of your own?" she asked.
No.
Worked ranch lines from Texas to Idaho. Slept under more stars than roofs. Norah leaned beside him. "You miss anything about that?" "Not lately." He glanced at her. "Truth is, I've been thinking on building. Here. If it's welcome." She studied his face. "Wouldn't be wise to build on another's land. I've been saving. Enough to buy a small parcel west of town, near the river bend. That land's rocky. Rocks can be cleared." She looked down at her hands. "You do all that? For a piece of hard dirt?"
For a home, he said.
One with laughter in it. Warmth. Faces waiting at the door. Norah felt something shift inside, slow and deep. "Takes more than land to build that." "I know. Takes someone to build it with." He didn't reach for her, didn't ask. Just stood there, letting the night speak. She turned to him, voice barely above the wind. "You mean to ask me?" "I mean to prove it first." Norah didn't answer, but she stayed beside him as the sky darkened and the stars came out. Neither of them moved until the lamp inside flickered out and the night fell full and quiet around them. By late July, the cottonwoods along the creek had dropped their first yellowed leaves, and Norah began waking before dawn without meaning to. The days were growing shorter, though the heat still clung to the air by mid-morning. She'd taken to watching the horizon again, not out of habit, but because she expected him now. Silas had been working the edge of his purchased land, cutting a rough boundary line through the brush with a borrowed axe and a borrowed mule. He hadn't asked Norah to come, but he didn't need to. One morning, she left Grace in the care of Mrs. Loring, who had softened after Grace started bringing her wildflowers, and walked west with a tin of bread and salt pork wrapped in cloth. She found him near the river bend, shirt damp with sweat, a tree half fallen at his feet. He paused when he saw her, hand resting against the axe handle. "You hungry?" she asked, setting the bundle on a flat stone. He wiped his brow with his sleeve, eyes never leaving her face. "Been hoping you'd come." She untied the cloth, laying out the bread in halves. "You ever cleared land before?" "Not this much of it," he said, sitting beside her. "But I've done harder things." She handed him a piece, watching the way his fingers curled around it. "You think you'll manage before the frost sets in?" "I'll finish before September's gone." "You always work this steady?" He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. "Only when it's worth it." They ate without saying more, the wind lifting the corners of the cloth like it meant to carry it downstream. Afterward, she walked the edge of the clearing with him, careful to keep her boots from sinking in the soft soil. "This spot here," he said, pointing to the slight rise near the bend, "I figure it'll stay dry through the rains. Would hold a house well." She stopped at his side, arms crossed. "You want to build it yourself?" "I want to build it right." She looked out across the line of cottonwoods. "You've got enough cedar to start cutting boards?" Traded for some. Might take a week or two to haul it all. She nodded. You'll need pitch for sealing. I know where it seeps thick from the rocks. He turned to her then, voice low. You'd show me? I'd help gather it. They stood quiet after that, the river gurgling behind them, a hawk circling high above the trees. She didn't reach for his hand, but she didn't step away either. By the next week, Norah brought Gideon to help carry stones for the foundation. The boy worked without complaint, his face red from the sun, glancing often to Silas for approval. When Silas showed him how to test a rock's weight before lifting it, Norah watched Gideon's shoulders straighten. You treat him like he matters, she said once, when Gideon had gone to fetch water. He does, Silas answered. He's part of you. On Sunday, Norah brought Grace along. The girl wandered through the tall grass, her new doll tied to her back with a strip of fabric. Silas built her a swing from a branch and a rope he'd saved from his pack mule. Grace climbed on without hesitation, her laughter ringing clear across the clearing. That night, Norah stayed behind as the children slept, a lantern lit on the porch. Silas sat in the chair beside her, arms resting on his knees. You ever think about what comes next? He asked. I think about tomorrow, she said. That's as far as I let myself go. He didn't press, just nodded slow. I've started drawing it in my head. The house, the hearth, a place with your bread warming on the sill. She looked down at her hands. People still talk. Let them, he said. They're not the ones who'll sit at our table. Her breath caught, just for a moment. You're certain about this? I knew I was when I saw you sit in the dirt beside your daughter and hold her like she was the only thing in the world. That kind of love don't fade. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and wood smoke. Norah turned toward him, her voice steadier than she felt. I've carried shame longer than I carried either of my children. I buried pieces of myself to survive. He reached for her hand, slow and sure. Let's build something honest. No burying. No shame. She didn't answer with words, just curled her fingers into his and let the quiet between them say what it needed to. When the lantern burned low, she stood. You'll need help raising those walls. I'll be ready. As she stepped inside, she looked back once. Silas sat there still, a man rooted, not drifting. And for the first time, she believed he was staying. The first frost came early that year, tracing the window panes with white breath and stiffening the ground beneath the cottonwoods. Norah woke to the sound of Gideon coughing in the next room, dry and shallow, not yet fevered, and pulled the quilt tighter around Grace's shoulders before rising. The cabin felt smaller with the cold, the walls holding the scent of wood smoke and boiled oats. She found Silas stacking split logs against the north wall of the new house, his breath visible in the chill. The frame stood tall now, rafters pegged and braced, roof ready for the cedar planks he'd hauled down the week before. He paused when she approached, rubbing his hands together to bring back the feeling in his fingers. You've been here since before light, she said, watching a jay dart through the bare trees. Wanted to get the walls sealed before noon. Cold's coming down from the hills. She stepped closer, the grass crunching under her boots. I can bring clay and straw if you're ready to chink those gaps. Silas reached for his coat pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. Pick this up from a surveyor passing through town. Shows the bend, the slope, water lines. I thought maybe we could mark where the garden ought to go come spring. Norah took the paper, eyes scanning the faint pencil lines. You've been thinking past the roof. I've been thinking about tomatoes. And cucumbers. And you standing in the dirt with your skirts pinned up, telling me I planted the rows too close again. She folded the paper carefully. You're terrible at spacing. He smiled, slow and easy, then looked toward the ridgeline. There's a valley over the rise. I was thinking after the roof's on we could ride there. Just us. Norah hesitated. Leave the children? I asked Mrs. Loring if she'd stay with them a day. She said yes. Thought you might want to see something that doesn't need mending or feeding. She studied him. What's in the valley? Nothing. That's why I want to show you. It's quiet.
Clean.
Just sky and grass and wind. The thought of it settled somewhere behind her ribs. I haven't ridden for myself in years. Then it's time. They went 2 days later, just after sunup. Gideon waved from the porch, face still pale but smiling, and Grace clung to her new doll as she curled beside Mrs. Loring on the rocking chair. Norah rode her old mare, the one she'd kept through lean seasons, and Silas led the way on his gelding. The trail climbed slow, winding through juniper and pine, the air growing sharper with each turn. She didn't speak, letting the rhythm of the horse clear her thoughts. At the top, the trees parted. Below stretched a wide basin, the grass blown flat in golden waves, and beyond it the mountains distant and blue, quiet as prayer. Silas dismounted first, tying off his reins, then reached for her hand. She let him help her down, though she didn't need it. They stood side by side, the wind tugging at her shawl. I used to dream of places like this, he said. When I was sleeping in cattle pens and under freight wagons, I'd see something like this in my mind and tell myself I'd find it one day. Didn't know I'd find you first. Norah didn't answer right away. The silence didn't ask her to. She watched the hawk circle above the basin, listened to the wind moving through the grass. I didn't think I'd be chosen again, she said finally. Not after everything. You weren't chosen, Silas said. You were found. She turned then, met his eyes. And you? He reached into his coat, pulled out a length of folded muslin. Inside was a ring simple, unpolished, shaped by hand. I had this made by a tinker, who owed me a favor. Nothing fine, but it's honest. Her breath caught, but she didn't move. I won't ask with words, he said. I want to show you. Every day, with every board, every fence post, every morning I get up before light, so your hands don't have to carry so much. I want to build this life with you, Norah. Not for you. With you. She took the ring, turning it in her fingers. It was warm from his pocket. You sure you want to bind yourself to a woman who's already brought 2 lives into this world? I prayed for strength, for someone who knew what love costs. You're the only answer I ever got. She held the ring a moment longer, then slid it onto her finger. They rode back late, the sun low behind them. Gideon ran to meet them, and Grace clapped when she saw her mother's hand. That night, Norah sat beside Silas on the porch while the children slept inside. They didn't speak. The moon hung full above the cottonwoods, and the only sound was the slow creak of the chair beneath them and the breath of someone who had finally come home. The wind came down from the north, sharp and dry, and the smell of snow rode with it. Norah stood at the edge of the new house, her hands dusted with lime wash, watching the last light catch the cedar shingles Silas had set the day before. The walls were sealed now, the roof pitched tight, and the hearth already blackened from its first fire. It was a house, not just a frame. A place that could hold laughter, sleep, and the long, quiet work of a life being lived. Inside, Grace sat on a braided rug Norah had woven from old wool scraps, feeding her doll with a carved wooden spoon. Gideon had taken to reading out loud now, poring over an almanac Silas had picked up from a peddler, sounding out the words slow and proud. Mrs. Loring still came by twice a week, but less so now, saying the children seemed steadier than they ever had. Norah wiped her palms on her apron and stepped inside. Silas was by the hearth, sleeves rolled, setting a pot of water to warm. He'd taken to shaving every other day, though he never said why, and had carved a drying rack for her linens that folded against the wall. Chill's coming in fast, he said. I know, she answered, stepping beside him. I packed the last of the beans in the root cellar. We've enough if the snow holds a few days. He stirred the pot with the back end of a spoon. You think we'll manage the winter here? She glanced at the walls, at the way the firelight danced over the smooth joints they'd fitted by hand. "We already have. Everything after this is just living." Silas set the spoon aside and turned toward her. "You remember the first time I saw you?" Norah gave him a look. "I wasn't exactly hard to miss. You were tired, still standing straighter than half the men I'd ridden with. And you didn't flinch when I looked at you." "I didn't have time to flinch." He reached for her hand. "You've made time since." She let him pull her in. His hands were warm from the fire. She rested her head against his shoulder, listening to the slow, even beat of his heart. "I bought a cow," he said into her hair.
She leaned back.
"You what?" "Rode out to the Miller Ranch yesterday. Gave them my last spare saddle and a few coin."
"She's not young, but she's sound."
"Calves regular." Norah blinked. "You didn't think to ask me?" "I figured you'd say no." "I would've. Then I'm glad I didn't." She tried to look stern, but the heat in her chest gave her away. "You plan to name her?" "Thought we'd leave that to Grace." Norah laughed, quiet and full. "She'll name it something foolish. Then we'll be the only ones with a cow named Rose Petal." They stood like that a while, the fire crackling low. Outside, the wind lifted the edge of the tarpaulin that covered the remaining cedar planks. Norah knew they'd need those for a shed come spring, but that could wait. Silas kissed her temple. "Will you marry me before the snow gets deep?" She looked at him. "You ask like it hasn't already been decided." "I want to ask anyway." She nodded. "Then yes." They married with the first snow falling, the preacher riding out from Laramie bundled in 3 coats, his wife holding the Bible open against the wind. Grace wore a ribbon in her hair, and Gideon stood proud in his mended coat, holding the wedding ring Silas had made. They said their vows under the cottonwoods, the world quiet except for the rustling branches and the muffled steps of the mare shifting beside them. Norah wore her mother's shawl, and Silas took her hand like it was something sacred. After, they shared bread and apple preserves inside the new house. The children fell asleep on a quilt near the fire, and Norah rested beside Silas, their hands twined between them. In the weeks that followed, the snow deepened. Silas split wood each morning, and Norah mended clothes by the hearth. Gideon read aloud more often, and Grace began humming lullabies to the cow, who had in fact been named Rose Petal. One night, as the wind held up against the windows and the fire burned low, Norah watched the shadows play across Silas's face. "You still think about drifting?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes soft. "Not once since I found this place." "This place?" He reached out, touching her cheek. "You." The seasons turned. Spring thawed the earth, and Norah planted onions and potatoes in soil they turned together. Grace learned to milk, Gideon learned to fish, and Silas built a porch swing that creaked just right when the stars came out. They never spoke of the past. Not because it was hidden, but because it had been laid down like stone, part of the foundation they stood on now. Years passed. The children grew. The garden spread. The porch saw birthdays, quiet tears, and long evenings filled with warmth. And in the house they built with their own hands, under a roof sealed against the wind, Norah and Silas lived side by side, weathering what came, steady in their love. Not loud, not grand, just true. And that was more than enough.